that passage quoted many times, so I'm not going to preach on that this morning. However, it's a wonderful prophecy, and Micah 4 verses 1 through 4 was quoted also by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. So it is likely that Micah and Isaiah knew each other, or at least were aware of each other. They both lived at the same time period. The difference was that Isaiah was a man of the city, the capital Jerusalem, and he was a confidant of King Hezekiah, whereas Micah was a man of the countryside. All we know about him is that he called himself Micah the Morsite in the very first verse of his book. The Bible Knowledge Commentary says Moresheth, called Moresheth Gath, in Micah 1 verse 14, is perhaps modern Tel Judaide. The town was about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, though its exact location is still disputed today. How little we know about this man and his wonderful prophecies. Micah, in his opening verse, tells us that he prophesied during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And the dates of these three kings means that Micah's ministry fell between 750 and 686 BC. Now, these were very momentous years in the history of Israel, very momentous. It encompassed the time of the Assyrian conquest and exile of the northern house of Israel between 732 and 721 BC, and also the Assyrian attack upon Jerusalem by Sennacherib in 701 BC. And we know, not from the Bible, but we know from the Assyrian records, that the Assyrians conquered all the fenced cities of Judah except for Jerusalem, and that story is in the Bible. And we know that there were 46 cities in all that were conquered by the Assyrians in Judah. We know that from the Sennacherib prism, which is in the British Museum in London, England. So in the midst of all this war and turmoil, the prophet Micah gave a wonderfully important prophecy, latter-day prophecy, that's virtually totally ignored by the pulpits of our land. And it has two parts. It's a two-part prophecy found in Micah chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. The first part deals with the dew. I probably don't hear many sermons about dew, but you will this morning. Micah 5 verse 7 says, "And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people as a dew from the Lord, as the showers upon the grass that tarrieth not for man, nor waiteth for the sons of men." The Kyle and Delish Bible commentary tells us two things are predicted here. In the first place, in verse 7, Israel will come upon many nations, like a refreshing dew from Jehovah, which falls plentifully in drops upon the grass, and will produce and promote new and vigorous life among them. Dew is here, as indeed everywhere else in Scripture, a figurative expression for refreshing, stimulating, and enlivening. The spiritual dew Jacob will bring to the nations. What a wonderful prophecy. So has that happened? Was Micah correct? Refreshing and enlivening the nations. An enlightening newspaper article from 1902 I came across was titled "A Pyramid of Bibles," and related how the British and Foreign Bible Society between the years 1804 and 1902 had an average annual rate of Bible distribution of 1.6 million copies. More than 3 copies every minute, day and night, 5 million copies of the Bible for each year. 500 copies of the Bible every hour. And one commentator said, if modern Israel are Gentiles, they may have done infinitely more witnessing for good than the Israel, he means the Jews, of whom the predictions were spoken. So said this newspaper published in 1902. Now there is so much that we have to be proud of in the advancement of Christ and Christian culture that has been done by Western Christendom. And yet, a totally opposite claim is being made against us in these latter days. You're probably hearing a lot in the newspapers about critical race theory. Unbelievable as it seems, today's American secular politicians and teachers unions are foisting a nefarious racial attack upon innocent school children in the public schools. Young, impressionable white children are being taught that their ancestors were actually malevolent and malicious people who foisted war and slavery on innocent other races. And our children today are being told that they themselves bear some of the guilt of their ancestors simply because they're white. Yes, children are actually being taught to hate and despise their own forefathers. And these type of teachings that are going on in America today are really advancing racial animosity, racial hatred, and misunderstanding. Nothing good is coming of it. Our young kids, in fact, are being told in the schools to, quote, try and be less white, unquote. And to me, that's a little bit like telling your pet dog, try and not be a dog. Or telling your pet fish, stop being a fish. What this is an attempt at erasure, an attempt to erase us from American life and culture, a thinly veiled, suggested erasing of our very culture and existence. The language they use almost seems akin to a form of wishful genocide. They'd like to just get rid of us, it seems, along with our statues and monuments and Western Christian heritage, which are all under attack today by the woke crowd. And it's incredible that the controlled media treats this hateful, racist rhetoric as something so necessary and wonderful. But having white skin is now something to be ashamed of, we're told. It grieves me to have to share this horrible, inexcusable racial persecution we find in America, but it cannot be ignored. It's a sign of the times. I believe that it is a sign of the prophesied time of Jacob's trouble, spoken of in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 30 and verse 7. To express pride in Western civilization now is something bad. It's Eurocentric. It's promoting white privilege. We can be charged with racism just for having pride in our forebears. So sad. So let's examine our history and heritage and see if our ancestors were as evil, wicked people as the critical race theory supporters now claim. Let's start with women's status in foreign cultures and religions. In Turkey, a century ago, before Western influence had an effect over there, we read that the life of the women within the harem is monotonous, and the occupation they find will not fill up their leisure hours. They do not read. Beings almost entirely destitute of ideas, who have seen nothing, read nothing, compared nothing, whose mind never outsteps the narrow circle of sensual appetites and domestic affections. And Osmanli Turk even avoids looking at the woman he meets in the streets. In some districts near Amoy, Turkey, only 7/10 of the females born are allowed to live. That was just a little over a century ago, and the situation is better today due to Western Christian influence. But it's only 7/10 of females were allowed to live. When looking at China, Barbary, Borneo, and Tartary, we find the condition of women something monstrous. Dr. Talmage says that the Burmese sell their wives and daughters so as many sheep. And of course, Burma is the modern Myanmar, where there's so much trouble going on with a dictatorship there. And in fact, a neighbor of mine, 2 doors down, was a reporter who was in prison for the last several months. And all around my town, there are signs to free Fenster, the neighbor. The Hindu Bible makes it disgraceful and an outrage on women to listen to music or look out the window in the absence of her husband, and gives us a lawful ground for divorce, a woman's beginning to eat before her husband has finished his meal. What mean those white bundles on the ponds and rivers in the morning? Infanticide, following infanticide. Female children ruthlessly destroyed simply because they are female. Women harnessed to a plow as an ox. Women veiled and barricaded, still true today, and in all styles of cruel seclusion. Her birth a misfortune, her life a torture, her death a horror. No refinement, no liberty, no hope for this life or for the life to come through Muslim religion. Ringed nose, cramped foot, disfigured face, imbruted soul. Imbruted is a word you don't often hear today, but it means to degrade someone to the level of a brute beast. And that is how women have been treated historically in foreign countries, especially Muslim countries. And this, of course, is the situation in Turkey just a century ago. But you can compare that situation with the Taliban in Afghanistan today. Women are not treated much better. And even though Christian evangelists have been addressing this as much as they can in that closed country. How about British rule in Egypt? In Isaiah 19, verse 24, it's plainly predicted that Israel should be a blessing in the midst of the land of Egypt. The Reverend W.H. Booth said, "The Egyptians are fully alive to the benefits of British occupation and are not ungrateful for the improvements which have been introduced. It is evident in the daily press. The British have abolished the accursed torture of the kubash." And that is a word I wasn't familiar with. In fact, I did a Google search and nothing came up. It's been totally eradicated so much you can't even find what the word meant on the internet. Kubash, the torture of the kubash of a century ago, now eradicated in Egypt. They have protected the people from tyrants. They pay no unfair taxes. They are not harnessed to the plow to gratify the caprice of the cruel Turk. Thanks to the British, the young cotton plants do not perish for want of water, as formerly when water was only supplied to rich proprietors at a high price, while the poor fellahin had to see their plants dying of drought. In Africa, King Prempeh of around the year 1900, ruler of the Ashanti city of Kumasi, a word in African meaning city of death, had 2 blocks of houses entirely occupied by executioners. The British put an end to African human sacrifice in 1896. African cannibals. In the report of a missionary association meeting held at Keswick, England, the Reverend J.H. Lorraine wrote, "Glimpses into the central Sudan revealed such horrors that one's blood almost ran cold as one listened. Here are places where Satan has unrestrained sway. Here, not long ago, 60 poor creatures were seen being led off to slavery. On the road to slavery, their brutal captors, for a few posts of honey, sold 10 or 12 of them as butcher's meat to a cannibal tribe through whose territory they passed. Such fiendish barbarities are being perpetrated daily," and this is 1904 I'm quoting from. "But thank God such cruelties are being suppressed wherever the British flag waves." So much for cruelty of Western Christians. In India, British engineers and 7 million English pounds, that's their money, probably the equivalent of $700 million today, built the lower Bari Doab Canal in the Punjab, India. It's in northern India, irrigating 871,000 acres of crops, making the desert to blossom on land formerly quite useless. Total expenditures of 40 million pounds paid for by British taxpayers put millions of areas under cultivation, giving livelihood for millions of Indian people. And yet they talk about that horrible British occupation of India. India before the coming of the British was a land of extremes, millions of underfed peasants, and a jeweled galaxy of millionaire Rajas and Parsis. The Hindu region of India was infamous for its practice of widow burning. When her husband died, the grieving widow was horribly burned to death in a Hindu ritual. This was outlawed when the British colonized India. And they talk about how bad the British were. India was a land of cruelty. The curse of India in times past and partly at present is the cruelty of the religions its people profess and its shocking practices in regard to the immolation of the widows on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands, as formerly permitted but now forbidden by the strong hand of the government of England. Its most hideous crimes are often perpetrated in the name of the Hindu religion. The cruel Hindu goddess Kali is supposed to sanction and invite the thugs to their horribly cruel murders which were common in India, till at last the British government interfered and created a special department of state with the most intelligent officers to hunt down these religious criminals and stamp out these pests of native society who lived by murder and robbery organized on a great scale. The dacoits, or bands of gang robbers, who at times devastated the country where they were allowed to have their way, are the dangerous pests of large tracts of India, organized by their sirdars or chiefs. These strike such terror by their crimes that the Indian courts are paralyzed. Now this was 1902, at the beginning of the British occupation of India, and they put a stop to all that. A religion of murder. Before the arrival of the British, the Indian Thuggee devotees numbered at least 10,000 men who wandered in organized gangs over the country, strangling travelers and spreading terror everywhere. Acting in accord with the supposed wishes of the Hindu goddess Kali, they were protected by this fact from the vengeance due to their deed. The people through whose midst they passed and from whom their victims were taken, though thought neither of rising against them nor of laying information before the authorities. That would have been to resist the Hindu gods. And so they resigned themselves to this as they would have done to any other supposed divine visitation. And that, as a quotation I got out of the Glasgow Christian Weekly, February 20th, 1902. And that has been put to a stop after the British interposed in India. British rule actually benefited India. Sir Herbert Edwards lectured to the Young Men's Christian Association of London in 1860 and said, "English rule has very largely benefited India, so largely indeed that history must needs write it down a blessing." Well, they don't talk that way in the newspapers and in the schools. They talk like, oh, these terrible white people came in and put these people in subjection and destroyed their wonderful culture. Their wonderful culture? Widow burning and all this other stuff? Oh my. For only consider what the Mohammedan rule was which English rule came to supersede. It was the rule of the Quran. In other words, the rule of the sword. And we still have that in the Middle East today, causing untold grief and turmoil. A rule in which war was rarely, if ever, known to cease in any reign, until we turned tail and left everybody behind practically and left Afghanistan. So perpetually was the kingdom racked with invasion from without or rebellion from within, a rule in general of religious persecution, converting whole districts under threats of fire and sword. And private vengeance was the justiciary of the poor. That was your only justice, fire and sword. A rule of forced labor and forced loans without repayment, under which no artisan was master of his own time or industry, and no merchant master of his gains, a rule which scraped wealth from the whole surface of the kingdom to heap it into a few glittering masses at the courts of the emperor and his viceroys, which was gorgeous in ceremonials and royal progresses, but depopulating and demoralizing in its daily life, a rule under which individuals indeed could rise to ambitious heights, but the masses sunk like stones. Now, English rule was, in its details, the very opposite of this. It was conquest, but it was also emancipation. It found 9/10 enslaved by 1/10. It subjugated 1/10 and freed 9/10. The British did. In short, it conferred more freedom than it took away, introduced peace into the land, that rudimental blessing without which there could be no real prosperity for any people. It reflected the mind of the favored country whence it came, meaning Britain, and inaugurated an era of industry and commerce. It has made life and honor safe, labor a property, and property an enjoyment. It has put all men, the Brahmin and the Sudra, on an equality in the courts of justice. It has raised the life of a man above the life of a cow in Hindu courts. That's quite a statement. It has protected women, forbidding slavery and abrogating the right of the Mohammedan husband to murder his own wife. It has abolished the cursed practices of the sati, infanticide, and human sacrifices to blood idols. It has almost exterminated thuggery, and it has kept down dacoity. And dacoity is referring to a band of armed robbers in Southeast Asia, India and Burma, Myanmar. In America, we had the American Indian savages. An article in 1891 related, "The Red Indians are savages and reckless as to life. Their warfare is cruel to a degree, and they give no quarter to a fallen foe, but dispatch him with terrible tortures," unquote, from an eyewitness in 1891. And of course, things are much better since the gospel was brought to the pagan Indian tribes. One historian says the worst governments in the world are Mohammedan. He said that in about the year 1900, but is it any different today? You're not allowed to say that it is so. Canadian government leader Earl Grey in 1912 said, "The British Empire is the highest attainable ideal on earth, the most potent instrument yet conceived for the spread of righteousness, duty, and peace throughout the world." How different that is than what we read in our newspapers and what's being taught to the children in the public schools today, where white people are bad, Christianity is bad. So let's just quickly summarize this part of the prophecy. Our white Christian civilization, Western Christian civilization that they are so antagonistic about, has, first of all, improved the status of women and reduced the incidence of female infanticide, the killing of female babies in the Far East. It has eliminated cannibalism and human sacrifice in Africa, eliminated widow burning in the Hindu areas of India, eliminated or reduced roving gangs of robbers in India, emancipated vast populations that had been enthralled to Muslim warlords. Well, we did, and now this last week or so we didn't anymore. Installed canals and irrigation to reduce starvation and poverty, all at our own taxpayers' expense. Promoted a higher standard of morality through the propagation of the Christian religion. And that's one thing our atheist newspapers and schools don't want to hear. So this is the true legacy of the so-called, what they call white privilege or Western civilization, which would more accurately be called Christian civilization. This is only what the Bible prophesied that God's Israel was to do in prophecy in Isaiah 58 verse 6, which says, "Is not this the fast I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke?" And who is the Israel that fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy? It's not the Jewish people. Now let's look at the second part of the prophecy of Micah, chapter 5 and verse 8. As a young lion, we read, and the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who, if he go through, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver. Micah 5:8. The Kyle and Delish Bible Commentary says, secondly, Micah 5:8, the rescued Israel will prove itself a terrible power among the nations, and one to which they will be obliged to succumb. No proof is needed that Micah 5:8 and 5:9 do not state in what way Israel will refresh the heathen. The refreshing dew and the rending lion cannot possibly be synonymous figures. Unquote from the Kyle and Delish Bible Commentary, one of the leading biblical commentaries used in Christendom today. The refreshing dew and the rending lion can't possibly be synonymous figures, but I want to express to you, point out, that they need not be of a synonymous time frame. At first, exiled Israel was scattered through the world like dew. Verse 7 we read. Later, after much growth, they would attack their enemies. Verse 8 of Micah's prophecy. These are not necessarily happening at the same point in time. As the contemporary English version translates Micah 5, verse 8, it says, at present they are scattered, but later they will attack, as though they were fierce lions pouncing on sheep. Their enemies will be torn to shreds with no one to save them. Unquote. Micah 5, verse 8. The Israel here in prophecy is obviously not the Jewish people. They're neither giving spiritual refreshment, the gospel, to the world's peoples, nor are they a terrible power among the nations. And I have a chart on the back table which goes into the two houses of Israel and their separate and distinct prophecies and promises. So feel free to pick up a copy. There's 25 historical and prophetical differences between the two houses of Israel, and the churches seem to know nothing about it, but the scripture verses are right there on the sheet for you to look up. The British Israel Bible Notes, edited by Jessie Bell, confirms this. She says, quote, if the dew refers to the blessing attending the missionary efforts of the present day, on the one hand we have Israel carrying the gospel, the standard bearers of the cross, as dew upon thirsty ground. On the other, they are the Lord's battle axe and weapons of war. These two sides of Israel's national life seem contradictory, but it is easy to group together a number of texts in confirmation of both. We'll look at that. The passage does not suit the Jews or millennial times, unquote, from this commentary. Another noted Bible scholar, the late Anglican bishop, John Titcomb, wrote, quote, mark the contrast. Did it not indicate two opposite lines of fulfillment? The one in anger against the world that opposed the Messiah, the other in grace toward the world that was willing to receive him. We must be very particular in keeping this clearly before us, because it will be found a golden thread by which we shall be enabled to unravel many of the otherwise apparently conflicting testimonies of messianic prophecy. And that's a quote that I found in Anglican Bishop John Titcomb's book, Revelation in Progress, from Adam to Malachi, page 302. Additional scripture prophecies on Israel being God's battle axe and a rending lion. Verses, again, that are totally ignored from the pulpits. Isaiah 14, verse 2, the prophet Isaiah said, they shall take them captives whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. Never happened with the Jewish people. Isaiah again prophesied in chapter 41, verse 15, behold, I will make thee a new sharp threshing instrument having teeth. Thou shalt thresh the mountains and beat them small, and shall make the hills as chaff. Now, Bible students know that mountains in prophecy are large nations, hills are small nations. Israel here is prophesied to be a sharp threshing instrument, having teeth, threshing the mountains, the large nations, and beating them small, and making the hills as chaff. You read these prophecies, and you can just envision in your mind something like the Goths and the Vikings in early Europe. That's what they did, not the Jews. Is there a connection? Of course there is. The prophet Jeremiah declared, Israel, thou art my battle axe and weapons of war. For with thee will I break in pieces the nations, and with thee will I destroy kingdoms. That's quoted from Jeremiah 51, verse 20, KJV. Micah 4 and verse 13 says, Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I'll make thine horn iron, and I will make thy hooves brass, and thou shalt beat in pieces many people, and I will consecrate their gain unto the Lord, and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth. Moses' deathbed prophecy declared in Deuteronomy 33, verses 16 and 17, And for the precious things of the earth and fullness thereof, and for the goodwill of him who dwelt in the bush, let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph. The 10 tribes of Israel, in other words, were called Joseph by the prophets. That's the house of Israel as opposed to the house of Judah, the Jews. And upon the top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Unquote. And notice here that it's speaking precisely, specifically, about the tribes of the house of Israel, not of the Jews, Judah. Dean Farrar, the late Anglican Bishop of Westminster, in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, again one of the most widely used Bible commentaries in Christendom, on 2 Kings 9 verse 6 says, How completely the prerogative of the chosen people rests in the 10 tribes, the house of Israel, as the most important representatives of the seed of Abraham, unquote. And yet the churches don't know anything about the 2 houses of Israel and their separate and distinctive prophecies. It reminds me of Genesis 48:16, which says of the house of Israel, let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And that has happened. These and other prophecies do not in any way fit the Jewish people, but have been exactly fulfilled by the Western Christian peoples. Again, what did Micah's prophecy say? At present they are scattered, but later they will attack, as though they were fierce lions pouncing on sheep. Their enemies will be torn to shreds with no one to save them. Verse 8 of Micah 5. Does sound like the early European tribes, but not the Jews. They've never fulfilled that. These prophecies have not been fulfilled by the Jewish people, but they have been historically fulfilled with exactness by the 10-tribe house of Israel. Well, what about a spiritual fulfillment? You might say, yes, we are God's Israel in a spiritual sense, and think that there is really no physical component at all. But the late Bible historian Douglas Onslow remarked, to say that the Gentiles, the world who are not Israelites, have the benefits of that new covenant to the exclusion of the people to whom the covenant is alone and distinctively promised is indeed to make the word of God of none effect, unquote. Very good point. God did not marry a Gentile church and transfer all the covenant blessings to it and take them away from Israel. Micah 5 and verse 7 said, And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people as a dew from the Lord, as showers upon the grass. And commenting upon that verse, a person said, what a beautiful picture of the Christian church. But he did not reckon with a Bible student being present. Stop, she said. Read on a little further and see how the next verse fits the Christian church. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles as a lion amongst the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among flocks of sheep. Who, if he go through, both treadeth down and teareth in pieces, and none can deliver? Does that fit the church? No, no. Taking the promise literally, Israel, the remnant of Jacob, is indeed as a dew from the Lord, with her missionary labors all over the world. She's also like a young lion going forth with her conquests, and overcoming the enemies who oppose her march of progress. Let us therefore strive ever to keep before our minds that our covenant-keeping God meant what he said literally. There's a term we sometimes hear, Englishing the world, through the spread of the English language, laws, Christian religion, and culture, all of which are now under attack. The Canadian Advance newspaper, I found this in issue of November 6, 1889. I dig back pretty far. Said, "We stamp our being and nationality upon the peoples we conquer to the extinction of their own." And that has been true. We have given Christian culture to the nations where we've gone. And the modern woke crowd talks about how terrible it is. Oh, those British came over and took over India and destroyed their beautiful culture and all this nonsense. However, it works in reverse too when they invade us and demand the extinction of our own Christian culture and institutions in our own land. So we see today the heathen in our land clamoring for the removal of not only monuments, but street and city names, and indeed even our Western heritage itself. I found interesting to read recently that a town in Missouri was inundated recently by a mob of angry, unruly, woke demonstrators who insisted that the city name be changed because the city was named after a man who had once owned slaves. The city administrators instead found a relatively inconsequential black man with the same last name, same surname, and promptly announced that henceforth the town name would be celebrating this other man instead. So they avoided the large expense involved in a city name change. But keeping the rioting mobs happy is getting very difficult to manage. So there you have it, a double prophecy in the book of Micah, largely ignored, that at least one Bible commentary thinks is contradictory. Israel as both a raging lion and a soothing dew at the same time, but it has been fulfilled in history exactly. Many of you use the King James Bible, which you may know originally included the Apocrypha. And in the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus, chapter 47 and verse 22, which Mr. Legg is currently studying that chapter, so I pulled out this verse for you. We read this interesting statement. "But the Lord will not leave off his mercy, neither shall any of his works perish, neither will he abolish the posterity of his elect, and the seed of him that loveth him he will not take away." Unquote. So let us close with the admonition to put our trust in God to get through these times of trouble. I'll close with that. Thank you for listening.